Hi, I'm Rachel. I am a product lead with about 15 years of experience in tech, probably about 10 of them in product management. For the past 5 years, I've been focused mostly on AI and recommendations. I spent 3.5 years at Meta for Instagram and Facebook. And then the last year I was at a startup called Arena, which creates AI algorithms for large organizations to automate their decision processes. And I am also a career coach, so I'm excited to work through a problem with you and this time be the one answering a question.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I really like your last workshop. It's very informative.
Thank you.
But enough said, I guess we'll dive right in. Are you ready, Rachel?
I'm nervous and ready.
Awesome. Cool. So I'm the interviewer for the day. My question to you is, how would you grow Netflix 3x in 5 years?
That's a lot. Growing 3x in 5 years, that's a lot of growth for a mature company like Netflix. So that's a tough one. So I want to lay out my roadmap of how I'm going to plan and do it. So the first thing I want to think about is Netflix mission. Then the second thing, I want to create a baseline and a target for the problem. Then I want to think about the third thing I want to think about is what does it mean to increase revenue? And I think roughly when you're talking about increasing revenue, you're talking about, you know, you have new markets or new products, sorry, markets or products. You either have new entries or growing. But I think I need to understand the targets to see where I'm going. Then I'll brainstorm some approaches, thinking about partnerships or new developments. I'll do some prioritization, I'll do some risks, and then I'll summarize with a roadmap. How does this sound to you as an overall plan to work through this?
I really like that. I definitely wanted to hear more about your take on matured product, but I know you have your structure laid out, so let's go for it.
Okay, so you called out that we're thinking about increasing revenue for Netflix 3x in 5 years. Netflix mission, as I mentioned, what I wanted to start with is to entertain the world. What does it mean to entertain the world? Why do people want to be entertained, right? Entertaining the world provides a few avenues for people, right? They can have escapism for the day to day life, kind of like you had a hard day at work, you get to watch your Netflix and relax. You get to expand horizons and learn about new things. That's another reason why people use Netflix, right? And when I'm thinking about the alternative to Netflix, it's really traditional TV, it's YouTube. You can also think about, TikTok, Reels as that kind of content, also content that isn't available on Netflix, podcasts, Spotify, sports, things like that. So these are different avenues that people use for entertainment, right? So if I'm thinking about the mission, I want to keep centered around things that would help people be entertained, have escapism for reality, and maybe even get a chance to touch on some of the gold dust that comes with watching TV. Okay, so I've spoken a bit about the mission of entertaining the world and a bit of the competitive landscape. I want to go for a baseline and a target, but I want to see if you have any questions for me first.
Yeah, I like how you laid out the mission and interpreting it for how it helps everybody escape their daily life. I certainly feel that way watching Netflix. But I find interesting that you also mentioned other channels, TikTok specifically. Help me understand how you categorize these two together as a form of entertainment.
Yeah. So when I'm thinking about like Netflix isn't only threatened by, other players in the traditional streaming market or in the traditional TV market. TikTok and Instagram Reels and YouTube Shorts, these are all new formats of videos that are shorter. So people can consume them, on their bathroom break on the way, when they take the subway, when they're sitting in a commute. It's very easy to consume that content. It doesn't require a high level of attention. And so it's kind of like maybe breaks, but because, especially for TikTok, because of how it's formed, people end up spending a lot of time on it, and they end up spending time that they might be spending on Netflix. Now, if people have other forms of entertainment, it also puts a threat on Netflix in terms of maintaining the revenue that they already have, because these are free forms of entertainment, which I suspect is why Netflix recently introduced the subscription model. So that's kind of how I think about it. Does this answer your question?
It does. And I'm sure you'll touch more in depth in terms of like who is watching YouTube, TikTok versus Netflix. So I'm definitely curious about learning more about how you assess who's watching it and then the difference
Mm-hmm.
between short form and long form entertainment.
Okay. So when I'm thinking about, I'm going to move on to
Please.
the baseline and the target. So currently, Netflix annual revenue is about $35 billion. So if I want to grow that 3x, I'm getting to the area of $100 billion. Now, I want to break this down further. So if I'm thinking about Netflix as something that costs an account, which can be up to 4 users if I'm not mistaken, but maybe even many more eyeballs, it's $20 a month. That means roughly $240 dollars a year per account. That means that we're currently at about 140 million subscriptions, if I got the math right. We're trying to grow this 3x, which means we're trying to get to the area of about 400 million in revenue. Now, the watcher's perspective, sorry, we're at 140 million subscribers. We need to get to 400 million accounts, sorry, because each account has probably more than one people using it. And Netflix historically has struggled with multiple users using the accounts. But if I'm thinking about the potential of the world is probably around 3 billion accounts, right? If we're thinking about 2 to 3 people per account. So there's definitely, in terms of like the number of eyeballs, there's probably potential. But when I'm thinking about the number 140 million or 400 million people that are eyeballs, it actually means that we're almost maxed out of what we can do with the developed world. And if we're going outside of the developed world, we're probably hitting diminishing returns in what we can charge per user, even if we have an ads tier in place, right? So that's something I want to be mindful of when I'm thinking about it. When you want to make these types of changes, what you want to do is you want to increase the revenue significantly. And if you're thinking about how to increase the revenue, what is revenue, right? It's the sum on your product mix, right? Each customer, what is the value per customer times the revenue per customer across the product mix. And right now, Netflix really has two products that are probably cannibalizing each other, right? You have your standard subscription and you have the ads tier. And those are probably, when Netflix introduced the ads tier, I'm not sure how many net new users it introduced, and it's very likely that they cannibalized each other. So that's kind of like thinking about the target. And for me, what I'm going to try and think about is how do we drive new markets and new products? Now, you asked me beforehand if I had to think about who's watching YouTube or TikTok Shorts versus Netflix. I think that younger generations are drawn more to the short form video content that requires less attention. And so potentially that's something we might want to be mindful of, because if that generation is watching other content that isn't growing up onto Netflix and isn't incentivized to create a Netflix account or to buy a Netflix subscription, that might create problems for Netflix that go beyond the revenue growth that they want to hit. Okay. Okay. So I started going after how you increase revenue, and I mentioned the revenue formula. how do I increase revenue when I need to create net new initiatives, right? So the way I'm thinking about it is I can think about markets or products, and for each of them, I can maintain or I can create something new. Now, through maintaining growth, it's very hard to reach a 3x trajectory within a 5-year time frame, right? So it's probably that I need to invest in new markets, new products. If I'm thinking about entering new markets, I can think about geography and I can think about new content verticals. So if I'm thinking about new geographical markets, as I mentioned before, Netflix is pretty established in the Western world, which means that breaking into new markets is going to likely require infrastructure investments, and it's probably going to require acquisition as well. When I say acquisition, one way that Netflix can do something fairly quickly is decide, oh, we want to buy this TV station or something like this in a new geography, right? And the benefit they get from there is the content can then be used for the rest of the subscribers pool. So if you're thinking about Netflix hit the Squid Game, for example, that's a Korean TV show. It was a big hit in Korea. It also translated to a hit in the US, which brought more people on board. But it's also important to remember that when you enter new markets, there are regulatory risks aside from the investments. There are probably and probably the spend per month that that the people have to pay for the entertainment is probably much lower than what you have in the developed worlds. Any questions on new markets before I go into new content markets?
Yeah, I love how you take things through at this point. Going back to the assumption you made about cannibalization, I wanted to know how you want to go about validating the cannibalization between their subscription and ads. The second question, as you talk about the internationalization, how are you thinking about the behavior you talked about? Like younger generations are more prone to short form content. Is that going to be the same in international countries, or is that just a phenomenon in North America?
That's a great question. So you asked me two questions, and the first one I want to make sure I address it. The first question you asked me around how would I validate the cannibalization between subscriptions and ads? The way I would probably do this is I would look at has the has the user group that you're serving increased as a result of the ads tier, or did you just shift some of the users from your pay tiers to your ad tiers? Meaning, if Netflix had 140 million subscriptions before introducing ads, and it still has 140 million subscriptions after, it just means that you changed the mix shift of your product. If you're able to generate net new subscribers without losing existing subscribers, then it's a net new revenue opportunity. And I think for developing world where there's less available spend, you're probably going to see more people probably opting into the ads. Also, they're probably less spoiled in terms of being used to having content ad-free because they're in their own networks. So it might be that investing in this is actually a great precursor for geographic expansion. The second question you asked me was around young adults and using short form video. I think that this is actually something that's happening outside of the US as well. TikTok and Instagram Reels are very popular in South America, in Asia, Southeast Asia. So I think this is a trend we're going to see. And it might be an area that Netflix wants to invest in terms, but what makes those powerful is that there's a social network around it. And Netflix doesn't have a social network. And maybe Netflix could invest in a social network, but that can be a very large investment when there are already pretty big players in the space. So that might be something interesting to look into. My fear is that people are so used to what they have, and that Netflix doesn't really have a free product and they're used to consuming that content for free, that it might be an area that Netflix can invest in, but I think that area is already pretty saturated. Okay, I want to go into entering new content markets. When I'm thinking about new content markets, I'm thinking mostly things like sports, podcasts, education, music, things like that. And I think given a time frame of 3 years, you can probably, for example, sports, you're not going to create a new sport. You can probably acquire, I imagine that a lot of these things can happen through acquisition. You can acquire, yes, like you can acquire a company like Disney acquired ESPN. You can acquire a podcasting hub like Spotify acquired. Education is an area that Netflix is actually pretty primed for developing a product around education, or they can acquire one if they want to, meaning Netflix already has the infrastructure to distribute. And then you can think about how you can develop something that creates education value, that especially if it's an external tier that adds added benefits. Meaning Netflix already has content like documentaries and things like that is growing popular on the platform. But here I'm actually talking about, imagine a Netflix university, right? So this could be, for example, Netflix could acquire a university to run its programs through Netflix, use the distribution system to make it more affordable for people to get education, and then create some sort of a mechanism to provide the degrees so people have the benefit of the education system. So this is some of the examples of entering new content markets. I want to go into building new products next, but I want to see if you have any questions for me first.
Yeah, I like the new content ideas. Earlier, you touched on whenever you go into a new area, you need infrastructure and partnership. So of those three content areas you talked about, which one would you prioritize? Which one you think has the most upside?
Yeah, so I was going to go in prioritization a bit later, but my gut tells me that sports probably has the biggest upside, because with sports, you have communities that are centered around sports. It's already an area, both in terms, it's also, to your point earlier about advertising, it's an area that fits in very nicely with advertisements. It's probably an area that you can, people are used to consuming sports with ads, so you could probably add that even within your non-ads tiers. You could probably add sports content with ads and reap the benefit of the ads during the sporting events. If you think about, Super Bowl is the best example for how much companies are willing to spend on advertisement on ads. But I also think that there's a lot of sponsorship, there's a lot of material, there's a lot of like swag you can buy. You can also create a gamified experience around sports, assuming there isn't a regulatory issue. So my initial hypothesis is that going for sports would probably be my highest priority.
I like that.
And I want to go into building new products, because I think that this is more of a mergers than acquisition, and it's turning into this. And in product management interviews, I think it's really important to highlight some of the new products. So when I'm thinking about building new products, then I think the education piece that I mentioned can be defined actually as a new product. Podcasts can be a new product. Music can be a new product as well. Advertising, I think it's really interesting, advertising. Netflix has an advertising platform. I think the shortcoming of that advertising platform is probably attribution, meaning you see ads, but if you don't have the way to buy it directly, I think the attribution is going to make it a bit harder for Netflix, even though it has a very good understanding on people's tastes and preferences based on what they watch, their interests. So I think finding partnerships around that is probably very helpful. Another thing I'm thinking about is creating a new premium tier. with better offerings. And when I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking about early access, exclusive content, creator engagement. Imagine that, you know, I don't know, you're watching a reality show on Netflix, and for an exclusive people, there's going to be a meetup in New York or in Nashville with the people on the show, and kind of like have that meetup, have them answer questions, get that stardust, or the stars of the shows kind of like doing Q&As with the audience after the show in like a direct way. That can be very meaningful. That can be a meaningful experience. The one thing I'm concerned about is I'm not sure it wouldn't cannibalize on what we have already. And I'm not sure that people will be willing to pay significantly enough to reach a 3x target. Another thing I'm really excited about is creating a marketplace for products that are displayed on the shows. And I think that's actually something really interesting because many of the shows turn into culturally relevant moments. We all know that when Stranger Things had the finale, people were watching it together. The Bachelor is, even though that's not on Netflix, becomes a cultural event moment. People want to buy the outfits. When you have a cooking bake-off, people want to have the recipes and try and create it yourself. If Netflix could create a marketplace where people can buy things very easily, that can be actually a very big revenue driver. And that can also come without the ads tier. It can even come in the form of an email. You know which shows you're watching. You can send them an email with the links to things to buy after the show is done, with the outfits, if it's recipes from the bake-off, and you can do it in a non-intrusive ways that make people feel like it's valuable. And even cooler, if you could actually click on the remote and you pause, you know how Amazon has the X-ray that tells you who the actors are? If during that pause you were able to see what people are wearing and where it's from, I'm pretty confident that people would make those purchases. And I think that's a pretty cool idea. So these are the summaries of my ideas. And I want to go for prioritizing them. And what I want to do for prioritization is I want to think about the reach, the impact, the confidence, the effort, alignment with Netflix mission, and I also want to think about the risks. And I want to go through them pretty quickly, prioritize them, and then based on the prioritization, define a 3-year roadmap that we can work through. Okay? Does that sound good? Okay. So entering new markets, I'm going to call this high. And when I'm saying new markets, I'm meaning new geographical markets. I think this is probably where you're going to have high reach, net new users. It's probably going to be high impact. My confidence there is a bit low to medium because of the spend habits of those countries and and I think that's also going to be on the risks, but that's one thing. On the effort, I think it's going to be high. You're going to require significant infrastructure investments. For example, if you're trying to put Netflix in sub-Saharan Africa, you might need to invest in infrastructure for internet that can sustain that. The alignment with the mission is quite high, and the risks are probably around regulations, infrastructure, and investments. I do actually think that if you go in these markets through acquisition, you might be able to generate valuable content that also enriches the lives of the people that are already subscribed to Netflix. So I think there's an added benefit there. So that's kind of like how I'm thinking about this one. So I'm going to give the risks here very high, and we'll see how we fit it in later on. This is probably going to be quite impactful. If I'm thinking about entering new content markets, I mentioned sports as an area that I'm very bullish on. I think the reach is going to be high, the impact is going to be high. My confidence in this is actually quite high. And I think then my effort, it's probably going to be very expensive because of how sports is already a form of content that people are already engaged with. And I think there are going to be a lot of risks, especially on the regulations, we see a lot of blocking of acquisitions happening from the SEC and the European Trade Commission. So this might actually be something that 3 years might not be even the time you need to verify the feasibility of it because of the regulatory environments. It could be that outside of the US, it's easier. And that's part of what I'll think about in prioritization. Podcasts, I want to say that podcasts is a pretty saturated market. And unless you partner with Spotify or something like that, it's pretty commoditized already. I think the reach is probably going to be medium. I think the impact's going to be low. My confidence in it is pretty low. I think also podcasts tend to serve the commuter population, and I think that population might not be, as they're commuting, I'm not sure how much they're engaging with Netflix, and if they can engage with Netflix, they probably already are. The effort is probably going to be high, and I think on the risk is probably going to be a bit more on the regulation, and also on being able to create a podcasting experience that creates monetization. So I actually think here, this is probably not going to be a pretty high priority. Education. I think on the education side, reach, I think, is going to be low if I'm trying to create a net new experience that is aiming for people to, for example, get university degrees through Netflix. The impact could be high because if you're thinking about the cost of a degree, it's very expensive. And if Netflix can slash that cost, that can be pretty powerful. My confidence in this is a bit low, and the effort is going to be high. You're going to need to be able to develop, in addition to being able to create that value, you're probably going to need to develop the product and the experience around that as well. Regulation's probably going to be a painful one. I don't see universities or education systems kind of like letting go of the powers that they have easily. And you have pretty good players in the market. You have Udemy, you have my brain just forgot the name, Coursera, Khan Academy, all of those. Music, I think, is similar. I think music is similar to podcasts, but I think the reach and the impact are higher. But I think it's such a saturated market with Spotify as such a big player. Amazon entering the market, YouTube's in the market. I'm not sure that's an area that I would want to go. So I think that the impact's probably lower and my confidence is lower and the risks are higher. And in terms of building new products, advertising, I'm pretty bullish on it in combination with entering new markets. And I am, and when I'm thinking about creating the new premium tier, I think the reach is probably low and the impact is probably low because of the cannibalization. So I'm not going to really focus on that. And then creating a marketplace for things that are displayed on the show. I love this idea. I think the reach is high. I think the impact is high. My confidence in this is pretty high, especially if you're thinking about young adults or professionals with spending capability. I think that market with the FOMO life would love to have the ability to buy these products. And I think it also works out really nicely if you end up going into the sports direction in terms of a synergy, because then you can sell the swag and like very easily buy swag, team content, things like that. So I think there, and I think the regulation, I think, is less of a risk there. If Netflix entered the ads experience quite easily, then I think that's kind of like how I'm thinking about it. So if I had to rank the biggest bets out of all I just said, it's going to be the biggest bet, I think, is the creating for the marketplace, because I think it leverages existing assets. You just need to be able to create the shopping funnel for it. I think that's probably on a product thing. I think it creates net new that can go on both tiers and create additional revenue. If I'm thinking that the average revenue from a user from an account per year is $240, if you can get them to buy things that generate revenue similar to that, you can probably double your revenue there if people buy from it and start using it as a channel. The next thing I'm really excited about is I am excited about the sports. I think that's something that ranked pretty high. I think podcast education, I ruled out. Music, I ruled out. And And then I think entering new geographic markets is something that I'm prioritizing highly. So marketplace first, sports second, entering new geographic markets is third, as far as I'm concerned, in terms of the bets I want to actually prioritize. How do I do it? I think if I'm thinking about it, I'm going to think about year one, year two, year three. For year one, I want to identify an MVP test for a marketplace for product. So this can be as easy as sending emails after shows with links to outfits or links to recipes with some sort of a revenue sharing with platforms similar to ads, and then see what happens with that. Let that run. If it works, in the second year, I can invest in building out a product experience where you click to buy, similar to the X-ray experience that I mentioned, and then launch it globally in year three. For sports, I think the first thing I would do in the first year is I would identify acquisition targets, and I would identify geographical markets that I can go into. And then in year two, kind of like hash out the details and probably identify an experiment outside of the US where regulatory constraints are easier and tap onto that. And then year two and three, go forward with the acquisition, identify more of them and incorporating that more, ideally in using the ability with the marketplace that we're creating to sell the swag as well. I think that can be quite impactful. And then finally, new geographic markets. I think the first year is figuring out which markets that Netflix isn't in already have the lowest barriers to entry, identifying those, understanding the infrastructure barriers, the regulatory barriers, and also whether the content that they drive there is valuable for content for Netflix outside of those countries. Then what I want to do in year two is start entering these markets, develop the audience, identify the content that I can serve outside of those markets, and then year three, kind of like rinse and repeat to enter markets, develop the infrastructure and all of that. So that's kind of like how I'm thinking about growing Netflix 3x in 5 years. You're muted.
I was gonna say, I can definitely tell you are excited about driving the 3x growth for Netflix. I, even hearing about it, get excited too. I also like how you are very clear in terms of the new market, new content, and new new entry. I'm curious though, in the beginning of our conversation, you identified TikTok as one of the competitor for Netflix right now.
Mm-hmm.
Should Netflix go for this e-commerce or marketplace, how are you thinking about Netflix marketplace competing against TikTok Shop? And TikTok Shop right now, it's shopping and selling in feed. Like as you were watching the short form, you can buy it. But it doesn't sound like that's the direction you are going with. So I'm curious, why or why not?
So I want to validate this approach before. So the way I put it is like year two, year three, start with the marketplace. Meaning the first year, I'm trying to create an experience that doesn't interfere with what you already have to see if people are interested in making those purchases. From there, then invest in the infrastructure. For example, Netflix runs on different streaming platforms, and you need to probably have some sort of compatibility, like what happens when you click the button on your remote. Like you probably need to be able to create that experience, be able to create the shopping experience, the navigation. Most people that are watching Netflix are watching it on a TV and not on a phone, which means you have less control in how to access the different items. So that's probably a product experience that I want to see. First of all, are people willing to buy and then develop that? Because even now, like I can tell you that even now, clicking on something as simple as skip intro is something that I sometimes miss on my remote. And maybe you can call me a millennial, you can call me old, but it becomes more complex when it's not on your phone. TikTok Shops has the advantage that it's on the phone. And I also want to be wary because I know the Instagram shopping wasn't necessarily a successful endeavor either. So I want
Mm,
to be a bit cautious in how we approach it. So that's why I said in year one, I want it to be an experiment. And then in year two, year three, I want to develop a product experience accordingly.
got it. I like that. My last question with regards to your new content for sports. You talked about acquisition. How are
Mm-hmm.
you thinking about the in-house production? Like, how would you make the trade-off between them buying something, I don't know, ESPN's content or whatever, versus them doing like production in-house? There are actually quite a few on Netflix right now.
Yeah, so I'm thinking more about when I'm thinking about what Netflix has in terms of production, it has reality TV shows. So, for example, what it has is like it has reality TV shows around sports. I'm actually thinking about buying the distribution rights for something like the NFL, but on a smaller scale to begin with, because I think that's where there's value there. People want to watch sports in real time. It could be a separate tier altogether or a bundle, so it creates new revenue opportunities. If you're just creating another sports show, I don't
Mm,
see it adding value that creates another tier of subscription.
I see. Okay. Well,
Well,
thank you so much, Rachel. I guess before I dive in, like, how are you feeling about it?
you're a tough cookie.
Am I?
I'm kidding. No, you asked me really good questions and you pushed me. This is a really hard question. In my opinion, it's so broad. And I think it's really easy to get boggled down in acquisitions. And I can say that the first time I tried answering this question, I was thinking purely on product development. And then a friend of mine who's an M&A told me, why don't they just acquire Hulu and all of those? They can just acquire their way into that revenue. And I was like, yeah, but this isn't an M&A thing, it's a product thing. So I kind of like wanted to bridge those two together and make sure that I cover all bases. Yeah.
Great. I love your energy, and I can definitely tell you spend a lot of time thinking about it. What I like, so just dive right in. What I really like is number one, you take the rim of the flow. Like there's sometimes I ask you about a question and I can tell I'm leading you to a direction that wasn't part of your path, but then you very fluidly take it back. So I really like that. I like how you tie the mission into more personal experience. I like you take Netflix and tell about how that you go through the day having a hard day, but then Netflix is what makes it better at the end of the day. Um, what else? I also like your excitement about e-commerce. I can tell like that's something you're very passionate about,
There may
even
or
without
may
you
not
go.
be a story. There may not or may not be a story, a personal story related to that. But yeah.
And I love in your prioritization, you already touched on risk because that's something interviewers usually ask, like, okay, these are all Sangui, you use the rice framework, what else? So you already check that box, which I really appreciate. There are two parts that I got a little bit either hung up or stuck. One is when you started doing the math on the fly. Like I think it was around like 5 to 6 minutes. You were doing that like 20 minutes monthly subscription. You were calculating like the TAM or something. I was with you up until you started talking about like how many population and then you lead up to like the internationalization. That's where I got a little bit like stuck.
Yeah.
Maybe we need to open up a document. I'm not sure, but I don't think that is the major part of the about your market analyses. Another part, I was wondering if we could maybe speed up a little, is when you do the prioritization. I love how crisp you laid out like the rise, the mission, the risk, and then you
Mhm.
have like all 4 to 6 criteria you are evaluating against. Perhaps a more succinct way would be, these are my prioritization criteria. And I picked this for this reason, were my top three. Because I think you ended up spending about 4 or 5 minutes just in
Okay.
that like table. But overall, I really enjoy your thought process. It's very thoughtful, it's very methodical, and it's definitely very strategic when it comes to like new markets, new content, and new product. It gets me excited about Netflix future. Maybe they should hire you to drive their product strategy for the next 3 to 5 years.
Well, maybe they should. Who knows? Somebody from Netflix is watching. Who knows? Why not?
Yeah, yeah, perhaps.
Thank you so much for your time, Evelyn, and for asking me all of these thoughtful questions and also providing me with this thoughtful feedback. Thank you so much.
No problem. Happy to.
Wonderful. Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Hey everyone, it's Kenton Kovesky here, the founder of Rocketblocks. Thank you so much for watching this mock interview video. I hope you found it informative and helpful as you are getting ready to prepare for your own interviews and hopefully landing that job offer you are excited about. We have a ton of great content on the Rocketblocks channel coming out on a weekly basis, mock interviews, mini lessons, and chats with our Rocketblocks experts. So if you haven't subscribed yet already, please do so. There is a big red button below. And if you hit that, you'll get all of our content as soon as it comes out. Thanks for watching and have a great day.